Israel and Palestine, one land, two nations, and one of the world's most complex conflicts. But this conflict didn't start here, not even close. Every war begins long before the first shot is fired, and this one has burned for a very long time, fueled by exile, occupation, and promises never kept. To understand the conflict we see today and the history behind, we must go back to the very beginning. The earliest known inhabitants of this land were the ancestors of the Canaanites, early farming communities who built settlements as far back as 9000 BC. Among them was Jericho, often called the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world, with walls dating back nearly 8,000 years. Over time, these early settlers evolved into the Canaanite civilization, a Semitic people who emerged around 3000 BC. Skilled in farming and trade, they built fortified towns across the hills and valleys, leaving behind pottery, temples, and myths that would shape the region's history. Among the Canaanite tribes were the Jebusites, who made their stronghold in Jerusalem. Long before it became holy to Jews, Christians, and Muslims, the Jebusites called it Jebus, a walled hilltop city guarding the trade routes of the region. To the west, along the Mediterranean coast, came the Philistines, likely arriving by sea from the Aegean around the 12th century BC. They established powerful city-states such as Gaza, Ashkelon, and Ashdod. Over time, their name would leave a lasting mark on the land, giving rise to the very word Palestine. But into this land also came a figure whose story would change the course of history: Abraham. According to tradition, Abraham was born in Mesopotamia, today's Iraq. From there, he journeyed westward, entering the land of Canaan. It was here, the scriptures say, that God made a covenant with him, that his descendants would inherit this land. For Jews, this covenant is the foundation of their claim to the promised land, passed down through his son Isaac and grandson Jacob, later called Israel. But for Muslims, Abraham, or Ibrahim, is a prophet and the forefather of Arabs through his firstborn son Ishmael, linking their heritage to the same land. Generations later, Abraham's descendants, the Israelites, appear in the biblical narrative. Led by Moses, they escaped slavery in Egypt in what is known as the Exodus. After decades of wandering through the desert, it was Joshua who finally led them across the Jordan River and into the land said to have been promised to their ancestors. According to Scripture, the Israelites began their campaigns by conquering Jericho, a fortified city of the Canaanites whose walls famously fell as they claimed the land. They continued to take control of other Canaanite cities, establishing tribal territories and asserting their presence. Yet, along the coastline, another power had already risen: the Philistines, fierce masters of war, whose cities thrived on trade, conquest, and the unyielding ambition to dominate the same land. So we can conclude, this land was never empty. It was always inhabited, always desired, always fought over from the very beginning. After the conquest of Canaan and generations of tribal rule under the judges, the Israelites faced a new era of challenges. Surrounded by powerful neighbors, the Philistines on the coastline, the Ammonites and Moabites east of the Jordan River, and the Arameans to the north, the tribes found themselves in constant conflict and without centralized leadership. It was during this period that the idea of unity began to emerge: a kingdom under one ruler, chosen to defend the people and bring order. According to the biblical account, Saul, from the tribe of Benjamin, became the first king of Israel, anointed by the prophet Samuel to unite the tribes and lead them against their enemies. His reign was marked by near constant warfare, particularly with the Philistines, whose military power and iron weaponry dominated the region. Archaeology portrays the Philistines as a sophisticated maritime people. Their pottery, architecture and metallurgy reveal strong cultural links to ancient Greece and Crete. Despite his initial success, Saul's rule faltered, and his downfall paved the way for David, a shepherd from Bethlehem whose rise to power marked a turning point in Israel's history. David defeated the Philistine champion Goliath, unified the tribes through both diplomacy and conquest, and eventually captured Jerusalem from the Jebusites, establishing it as the political and spiritual center of his kingdom. His son Solomon inherited this kingdom at its height. The Bible describes Solomon's era as a time of peace, prosperity, and wisdom. He strengthened alliances with neighboring powers, expanded trade, and oversaw the construction of the first temple in Jerusalem, a place that would become the heart of Jewish worship and identity. In Judaism, David and Solomon are revered as divinely chosen kings who fulfilled God's covenant, establishing a kingdom and the temple as the center of worship, while in Islam they are honored as prophets who guided their people with wisdom, justice, and devotion, calling them to worship the one and only God. After Solomon's death, the golden age of unity began to fracture. Heavy taxation, forced labor, and political rivalries divided the once united kingdom. By the late 10th century BC, Israel split in two: the northern kingdom of Israel, with its capital in Samaria, and the southern kingdom of Judah, centered in Jerusalem. In 722 BC, the Assyrian Empire swept through the north, destroying the kingdom of Israel and scattering its people, the so-called 10 lost tribes. More than a century later, in 586 BC, the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem, destroyed Solomon's temple, and carried thousands of Judeans into exile. For the Jewish people, this was not just the fall of a kingdom, it was a spiritual crisis. While Israel and Judah faced exile, the Philistines also met their end during this turbulent era. Their downfall came not through Israelite conquest, it came with the Assyrian Empire. By the time the Babylonians rose to power, the Philistines had already lost their independence entirely. In 539 BC, Babylon fell to a new empire, Persia. Its king, Cyrus the Great, unlike those before him, ruled not through fear, but through tolerance. He allowed exiled peoples to return to their homelands, and among them were the Israelites. The first exiles stepped back onto the ruins of Jerusalem. The temple was rebuilt. It marked the beginning of what history remembers as the Second Temple period. In 332 BC, Alexander the Great swept through the Levant, bringing the language, culture, and ambitions of the Greek world. For over a century, the region came under successive Hellenistic empires. The Seleucids and later King Antiochus IV sought to impose Greek religion and culture on the Jewish population. Out of this oppression rose a spark of rebellion. In 167 BC, the Maccabees, a small band of Jewish fighters, rose against the Seleucid forces, reclaiming Jerusalem and rededicating the temple in a victory remembered today as Hanukkah. From this revolt emerged the Hasmonean kingdom, a brief period of Jewish sovereignty, but peace was fragile. By 63 BC, Rome arrived, ending Hasmonean independence and beginning centuries of Roman dominion. Herod the Great, installed as king by Rome, undertook massive building projects, including the expansion of the Second Temple, transforming it into one of the most magnificent religious structures of the ancient world. It was during this Roman period that Jesus of Nazareth appeared. Born around 4 BC in Bethlehem, Jesus lived under Roman rule in Judea, preaching, teaching, and gathering followers. His ministry unfolded across Galilee, Judea, and Jerusalem, challenging both religious authorities and imperial norms. His crucifixion in Jerusalem under Pontius Pilate became the defining moment for a new faith, Christianity, rooted in Jewish tradition but expanding across the Roman world. Meanwhile, tensions between the Jewish population and Roman authorities simmered. Heavy taxation, religious disputes, and resistance to foreign rule culminated in major revolts. The Great Jewish Revolt from 66 to 73 AD, which led to the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD. Jerusalem was razed once again, and Emperor Hadrian rebuilt it as a Roman city, naming it Aelia Capitolina and banning Jews from entering under penalty of death. Then he renamed the land itself from Judea to Syria-Palestina, invoking the ancient name once associated with the Philistines, the historic rivals of Israelites. From the Jewish perspective, this act was a deliberate attempt to erase the name and memory of Judea, a final blow against a people already scattered. But from a Palestinian and regional historical perspective, the name Palestina had far older roots. Greek historians like Herodotus, centuries before Rome, had already referred to this region as Palestine Syria, a land between Egypt and Phoenicia. By the 4th century AD, Rome had changed. Under Emperor Constantine, Christianity, once persecuted, became the faith of the empire. Jerusalem was reborn as a Christian city. His mother, Helena, journeyed to the Holy Land, identifying sacred sites. Golgotha, believed to be the place of Jesus' crucifixion, the tomb of his resurrection, and Bethlehem, the birthplace of Christ. Over these places rose some of the most revered monuments in Christian history: the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem and the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. For the first time, the Holy Land became a global center of pilgrimage, not for Jews, but for millions of Christians. The Jews, however, were still forbidden to reside in Jerusalem, a ban that had persisted since the days of Emperor Hadrian. Under Byzantine rule, anti-Jewish laws also increased, restricting synagogue construction and religious expression. But history turned once more. In the 7th century, from the deserts of Arabia, a new faith arose: Islam. By the 7th century, Byzantine rule over Jerusalem had grown oppressive. Corruption spread, heavy taxes burdened the poor, and even among Christians, divisions and persecution tore the faithful apart. Centuries of Roman control had left the land fractured and exhausted. Then, in 638 AD, the armies of Islam approached, led by Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab. The city surrendered peacefully, and Caliph Umar entered the city not as a conqueror, but with humility. He met with the Patriarch Sophronius and promised protection for all its people. Christians kept their churches, and Jews, after 500 years of exile, were finally permitted to return. When the hour of prayer came, Umar was invited to pray inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, but he refused. "If I pray here," he said, "future generations may claim it as a mosque." Instead, he prayed outside, on nearby ground, where Muslims later built the modest mosque of Umar, a quiet symbol of coexistence. Caliph Umar also cleared the neglected Temple Mount, a place left in ruins, used as a garbage heap under Byzantine rule, and ordered it to be restored and purified. On this sacred ground, he built a simple wooden prayer house, a humble structure that would later evolve into Al-Aqsa Mosque, marking the site where Muslims believed the Prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven during the miraculous night journey. But this same ground would become the center of one of history's most enduring disputes between Muslims and Jews over where the ancient Jewish temples once stood. It is important to note that to this day, No direct archaeological evidence confirms that a temple stood beneath the present-day mosque, and the precise location of the ancient temples remains uncertain, though most historical sources place them somewhere on or near the current Temple Mount in Jerusalem. After the Muslim conquest, the land became part of Bilad el-Sham, or Greater Syria, with Damascus as its capital. Within this province, Palestine formed the military district of Jund-Philistine, with Jerusalem called Beit al-Maqdis, the Holy House. Over the centuries, the city's name evolved into Al-Quds, the Holy, the name still used today. For centuries, Jews, Christians, and Muslims coexisted peacefully under Islamic rule. But in the 11th century, Europe's gaze turned east. The Crusades began, launched by European powers to reclaim the Holy Land for Christianity. Armies bearing the cross swept through the region, capturing Jerusalem in 1099. The aftermath was brutal. Muslim and Jewish inhabitants were massacred, and the city became the capital of a Crusader kingdom, with churches rising where mosques once stood. The Crusaders established a rigid feudal system, importing European customs and governance, and creating a military and religious elite that dominated local life. Trade routes shifted to serve their cities, and new ports along the coast, such as Acre and Jaffa, flourished under Crusader control. Pilgrimage routes for European Christians were reinforced, while Muslims and Jews were heavily restricted in movement and worship. Yet less than a century later, in 1187, Salahuddin Ayyubi reclaimed Jerusalem for Islam again. His victory was marked not by vengeance, but mercy. Unlike the Crusaders before him, Salahuddin allowed Christians to leave peacefully and reopened the city's holy sites to pilgrims of all faiths. Through the following centuries, Jerusalem changed hands between Crusaders, Ayyubids, and later the Mamluks, until 1517, when the Ottoman Empire took control. Under Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, the city's walls were rebuilt, the same walls that stand today. For over 4 centuries, Jerusalem and Palestine remained part of the Ottoman Empire, a mosaic of peoples living in a coexistence. But in the 20th century, the world would change again. Empires would collapse, new nations would rise, and the Holy Land, once ruled by kings and caliphs, would once again become the center of the world's most enduring conflict. Across Europe, new ideas were taking root. Zionism. Born in the late 19th century under Theodor Herzl, the Zionist movement sought to establish a national homeland for the Jewish people as a response to rising persecution and brutal waves of anti-Semitism sweeping across Europe and Russia. After briefly considering other locations, including Uganda and Argentina, Zionist leaders chose Palestine, the ancient land of Israel, because of its connection to early religious history. At the same time, new ideas were also stirring among the region's Arab inhabitants. Arab nationalism was on the rise, and more people in Palestine were beginning to see themselves not only as Arabs, but as Palestinians, a distinct people rooted in their land, culture, and centuries of shared heritage. When the First World War erupted in 1914, the Ottomans sided with Germany, while Britain saw an opportunity to weaken the old caliphate and expand its own influence. The British promised independence to Arab leaders if they rose against the Ottomans. Led by Sharif Hussein of Mecca and supported by British figures like Thomas Edward Lawrence, known as Lawrence of Arabia, the Arab Revolt began in 1916, and by 1918 the once mighty Ottoman Empire had fallen. But meanwhile, the British issued a new declaration and betrayed the Arabs. Secret deals were being written in London and Paris. In the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, Britain and France secretly divided the Middle East into zones of control, and in 1917 another declaration shifted the balance entirely. the Balfour Declaration, in which Britain pledged to support the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. With the British taking control of Palestine from the Ottomans, the territory became known as the British Mandate for Palestine. Jewish immigration from Europe increased significantly. A slogan began to circulate: "A land without a people, for a people without a land." New settlements spread across the land, but Palestine was, of course, a land with a people. More than 850,000 Palestinian Arabs, both Christian and Muslim, lived across its towns and villages. For them, it felt as if their homeland was being taken from beneath their feet. By the mid-1930s, tensions erupted into the Arab Revolt, a widespread uprising against British rule and Jewish immigration. The British responded with overwhelming force. Thousands of Palestinians were killed, and their leadership was dismantled. During the revolt, Jewish militias such as the Haganah cooperated with the British, providing intelligence, local support and protection for settlements. To calm the unrest, Britain issued the 1939 so-called White Paper, limiting Jewish immigration, and promised to set up an independent Palestine state within 10 years. But by the 1940s, new underground Zionists groups like Irgun and Lehi turned their weapons on the British themselves, setting off bombs across the country and killing many Palestinian civilians. Following the Second World War and the horrors of the Holocaust in Europe, Zionist calls for a sovereign Jewish homeland grew even more louder, and ships carrying Jewish refugees who had survived the Holocaust sailed toward Palestine, despite British restrictions on immigration. By 1947, Britain handed the issue of Palestine to the newly formed United Nations. The UN proposed a plan to partition Palestine into two states, one Jewish, Israel, and one Arab, Palestine, with Jerusalem placed under international administration. The Zionist leadership under Ben-Gurion accepted the plan. However, the Arab leadership rejected it, viewing the UN partition as another form of European colonialism, one that unjustly granted the Jewish minority control over the majority of Palestinian land. In March 1948, as British forces prepared to withdraw, the Zionist leadership approved what became known as Plan Dalet, or Plan D. Officially, it was described as a defensive strategy to secure areas assigned to the Jewish state under the United Nations plan. But in reality, its reach extended far beyond those borders. Zionist forces launched coordinated offensives across Palestine, not only within the territory allocated by the UN, but deep into Arab-designated areas as well. Cities, all home to tens of thousands of Palestinians, came under attack. Villages were emptied, populations expelled, and entire communities vanished almost overnight. And so, the stage was set for a war that would change the Middle East forever. On May 14, 1948, the British officially withdrew from Palestine, and on the same day the Zionist leadership proclaimed the establishment of the State of Israel. Within hours, neighboring Arab states, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon and Iraq, entered the conflict, declaring their support for the Palestinian Arabs. What followed was the first brutal Arab-Israeli war. The war continued until March 1949, and despite being outnumbered, Israel emerged victorious. This was mainly because the Jewish forces were already well organized and trained from years under the British mandate. Israel also received crucial international support, particularly from Czechoslovakia, which supplied weapons and aircraft under Soviet approval, and growing political recognition from the United States and European nations, which quickly acknowledged the new state. By the war's end, Israel had expanded its territory far beyond what had been granted by the UN Partition Plan, while the West Bank came under Jordanian rule and Gaza under Egyptian control. For the Arab world, the loss was a humiliation, But for the Palestinians, 1948 became known as Al-Nakba, the catastrophe. More than 700,000 Palestinians were expelled or fled. Over 400 villages were destroyed or depopulated. It was the beginning of a long exile and brutal occupation. Then, in 1967, Israel fought another war against its neighboring Arab states. During the Six-Day War, Israel captured the Sinai Peninsula and Gaza Strip from Egypt, the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan, and the Golan Heights from Syria. For the first time, Israel controlled all of historic Palestine, including Jerusalem's Old City, home to the Western Wall, Al-Aqsa Mosque, and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. For Palestinians, the outcome was devastating. Hundreds of thousands were displaced once again, while those who remained suddenly found themselves under Israeli military occupation, subject to checkpoints, curfews and restrictions that would define daily life for decades to come. Israel began establishing settlements in the newly occupied territories, particularly in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. These settlements, built on confiscated Palestinian land, became one of the central obstacles to any future peace agreement. In 1978, Israel and Egypt signed the US-brokered Camp David Accords, and shortly after, Israel returned the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt as part of a formal peace treaty. At the time, this move was highly controversial across the Arab world. Egyptian President Anwar Sadat was later assassinated in part due to outrage over the agreement. Over the following decades, other Arab states gradually moved toward peace or normalization with Israel, even if most stopped short of signing formal treaties. However, Israel's military continued to occupy the Palestinian territories, and the conflict increasingly shifted from an Arab-Israeli war to an Israeli-Palestinian struggle. Now, the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, formed in the 1960s to seek an independent Palestinian state and led by Yasser Arafat, continued to fight alone against Israel, primarily through guerrilla warfare launched from bases in Jordan and later from Lebanon. But on the ground, frustration among Palestinians in the occupied territories had reached a breaking point. Decades of military rule, expanding Israeli settlements on Palestinian land, land confiscations, and the daily humiliation of checkpoints created unbearable tension. And then in 1987, after an Israeli army truck killed 4 Palestinians in Gaza, a massive uprising erupted, known as the First Intifada, meaning the shaking off. What began as spontaneous protests quickly spread across the West Bank and Gaza Strip, with widespread demonstrations, strikes and boycotts against Israeli rule. During this same period, a new movement emerged, Hamas. Founded by Palestinian Islamic scholar Ahmed Yassin, unlike the secular PLO, Hamas rejected the idea of negotiating with Israel and instead called for the liberation of all of historic Palestine. Over the 6 years of the Intifada, more than 1,000 Palestinians and around 100 Israelis were killed. The First Intifada transformed global perceptions of the conflict. For the first time, the world saw the Palestinian struggle not merely through the lens of armed factions like the PLO, but as a grassroots movement of an occupied people demanding freedom and dignity. By the early 1990s, after years of bloodshed and international pressure, it was clear that Israelis and Palestinians have to make peace. The result was the Oslo Accords, a historic agreement that marked the first direct peace talks between Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization. Under the Accords, both sides officially recognized each other. Israel recognized the PLO as the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, and the PLO recognized Israel. The agreement created the Palestinian Authority, giving it limited self-rule in certain parts of the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and outlined a 5-year plan for further negotiations. For some, it was a moment of hope, symbolized by the famous handshake between Yasser Arafat and Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, witnessed by US President Bill Clinton. But not everyone accepted it. Many Palestinians, including Hamas, saw Oslo as a betrayal, believing it gave too much without guaranteeing a real state. On the Israeli side, right-wing groups opposed any concessions, and in 1995, Rabin was assassinated in Tel Aviv by an Israeli extremist opposed to the peace process. The dream of lasting peace began to fade soon after. A major peace effort at Camp David in 2000 ended without agreement, setting the stage for a new and more violent chapter. The spark came in September 2000, when Ariel Sharon, then the leader of Israel's opposition, made a highly controversial visit to the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound in Jerusalem, one of the holiest sites in Islam. To Palestinians, Sharon's visit was seen as a deliberate provocation. Clashes erupted almost immediately, spreading across the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and soon escalated into a full-scale uprising, the Second Intifada. The violence that followed was devastating. Suicide bombings, Israeli military incursions, and daily confrontations turned the region into a war zone. By the time it finally wound down a few years later, around 1,000 Israelis and 3,200 Palestinians had been killed. The Second Intifada fundamentally changed the conflict. In 2002, Israel began constructing what it called a security fence, walls and barriers around Palestinian territories, along with checkpoints to control Palestinian movement. The barrier cut deep into the West Bank, separating towns and villages from their farmland, schools, and workplaces. More than 500 permanent and temporary checkpoints were established across the West Bank, along with roadblocks, trenches, and restricted military zones. For Palestinians, it became a symbol of occupation, often called the Wall of Apartheid, seen as a tool designed to make normal life impossible. More and more Jewish settlements are systematically smothering Palestinians in the West Bank, who often respond with protests. They remain trapped under an ever-growing occupation, with no clear path to independence. The continued expansion of these settlements further undermines the foundations of a future Palestinian state. Meanwhile, Israel withdrew from Gaza, and Hamas gained power, but soon split from the Palestinian Authority after a short civil war, dividing Gaza from the West Bank. Israel then imposed a total blockade by air, land, and sea, limiting the entry of goods, fuel, and people. Electricity and clean water became completely controlled by Israel, and Gaza's population of over 2 million people was trapped in one of the most densely populated areas on Earth. Hamas and other groups began periodic wars with Israel. Israel carried out airstrikes across Gaza, while Hamas fired rockets into Israeli cities. The fighting overwhelmingly killed Palestinians, mostly civilians, including women and children. Over the decades, more than 134,000 Palestinians have been killed as a result of the occupation, and millions were driven from their homes. And while the world slowly lost interest in the Palestinian cause and their struggle for independence, Israeli settlements kept expanding, seizing more and more land across the West Bank, tightening the grip of an occupation that seemed endless. The pressure was building, and Israel's occupation had created a reality too unbearable to last. And as history has often shown, when injustice goes unanswered long enough, it eventually explodes. On October 7, 2023, Hamas launched a massive and unprecedented attack from Gaza into southern Israel, breaking through the heavily fortified border, firing thousands of rockets and storming nearby towns and villages. Around 1,200 Israelis were killed that day, and more than 250 were taken hostage. It was the deadliest day in Israel's history. Within hours, Israel unleashed a relentless bombing campaign across the Gaza Strip. What followed was a devastating war. The IDF entered Gaza, entire neighborhoods were destroyed, and hospitals and schools were reduced to rubble. The siege grew even tighter. over 2 million people were trapped and displaced, left without food, clean water or electricity, cut off from the world and stripped of the basic necessities of life. The war that Israel waged was described by many around the world as a genocide. In 2024, the International Criminal Court later sought arrest warrants for several Israeli leaders on war crimes charges, including Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's prime minister at the time. As images of destruction and suffering spread globally, sympathy for the Palestinian cause reignited, and more countries from the Western world and European Union formally recognized Palestine as a sovereign state and renewed calls for a two-state solution, an idea Israel had long resisted. By October 2025, after nearly 2 years of relentless fighting and failed ceasefires, a US-brokered peace initiative, led by US President Donald Trump, brought Israel and Hamas to the negotiating table. On October 9, 2025, both sides signed the first phase of a peace accord, followed by a high-level summit in Egypt on October 13th, a fragile but historic step toward ending one of the bloodiest conflicts of the century. The aftermath was catastrophic. Over 1,000 Israeli soldiers and security forces were killed, and more than 20,000 were injured. On the Palestinian side, officials reported over 68,500 killed and 170,000 injured in the Gaza Strip alone. The majority of the victims were civilians, women, children, and entire families. Thousands more remain missing, buried beneath the rubble. Additionally, more than 1,000 Palestinians were killed in the occupied West Bank. The scale of destruction was almost unimaginable, with damage exceeding $70 billion, leaving Gaza in ruins not seen since the devastation of the Second World War. From now on, no one truly knows where this conflict will go or whether the fragile peace deal will last and for how long. But nearly everyone agrees that the situation as it stands cannot continue, that Israel's occupation and control over millions of Palestinians is simply too unstable to last. Because after more than 75 years of conflict, one truth remains undeniable. There can be no lasting security for one people without freedom and dignity for the other.